Whenever we get into a debate about the minimum wage in this country, people inevitably bring up the 1968 minimum wage. Supposedly, this is when the minimum wage peaked. It was a value of $1.60 and it was raised in February of 1968. If you adjust it for inflation, it comes out to something like $11.13 in today's money. People bring this up whenever a state raises their minimum wage to say $10 an hour, like Massachusetts and Connecticut did. People will then turn around and say, $10 an hour? That's not even as high as it was in 1968. Or, if we talk about what the minimum wage would be if it had kept up with productivity, people often use the 1968 minimum wage as a starting point. But while everyone loves to talk about the value of the minimum wage, what everyone misses about the 1968 minimum wage was its coverage. The idea of an all-inclusive minimum wage that covers everyone in every sector equally did not happen until 1978. In fact, the people who are protesting the hardest for raising the minimum wage would not have even been covered under the 1968 minimum wage. Currently, the Fight for 15 campaign is being led by fast food workers and child care workers. Neither of these two groups would have been covered under the 1968 minimum wage, so why even bring it up? For proof of this, let's take a look at the average hourly earnings of non-supervisory employees in the hospitality and leisure industry. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has been keeping track of their average hourly earnings every single month since January of 1964. And here's a graph of what it is in nominal terms. Now, in theory, their average wage should always be above the federal minimum, right? When we look at the data more carefully, we see that in the 1960s this was not the case. In February of 1968, when the minimum wage was raised to $1.60, it didn't affect people in the hospitality and leisure industry at all. Their wage was $1.48 on average, 12 cents an hour below what was supposed to be the federal minimum. Why was it that people in the hospitality and leisure industry got paid less than the 1968 minimum wage? Because it didn't cover them. So now, let me give you the real history of the minimum wage and how it didn't become the all-inclusive thing it is today until 1978. When the minimum wage was first passed in 1938, it was before the Supreme Court decision Wickard versus Filburn. As a result, Congress had a very different interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Interstate commerce meant something was built in one state and sold in another. Therefore, Congress's ability to regulate interstate commerce was very limited. Initially, when the minimum wage was first passed, it only affected people in the following industries: manufacturing, mining, transportation and warehousing, and then a few other miscellaneous industries that were deemed necessary to encourage interstate commerce, such as finance and real estate and insurance and in utilities like electricity and all this other jazz. According to a document by the Department of Labor published in 2013, on the 75th anniversary of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the original minimum wage in 1938 only covered 39% of men and 14% of women, so it had a very limited coverage. Over time, Congress kept expanding the definition of interstate commerce so that it could include as many people as possible. In 1961, the Fair Labor Standards Act was amended so that it would include construction workers under its new minimum wage, as well as retail workers as long as they had at least $1 million a year in sales. That comes out to about $8 million in today's money. But it wasn't until the 1966 amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act that we really started seeing some true coverage increases. The 1966 amendments included the following groups: hotels and motel workers, restaurant workers, anyone who worked for a hospital or a school, public or private, so a lot of janitors, nursing homes, allegedly child care workers, taxi cab drivers, bus drivers, anyone working for a state or local government, and anyone working for a federal contract for the federal government. These are all the people that we think about when we think about low wages. Janitors at schools, bus drivers, hotel workers, and restaurant workers, and people who work at nursing homes. None of these people were covered at all by the minimum wage until 1966. But even then, they were covered under a different minimum wage. While the official minimum wage, which applied to people in the manufacturing and mining sector, was raised to $1.60, all of these people were given their own separate minimum wage of $1 per hour beginning on February of 1967. It was raised by 15 cents an hour every single year until it reached $1.60 in February of 1971. But the late 60s and the early 70s were a time of high inflation. As a result, their minimum wage never had the purchasing power of the $11 that everyone likes to idolize, but was rather closer to about $9.40 in today's money. Again, it would not be until January of 1978 that we had this all-inclusive minimum wage that just covered every sector equally.